welcome. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this exciting presentation by Professor Boris Dralyuk, whom I'm going to introduce shortly. I just want to say that it's really a rare opportunity that we have a guest visitor who is a critic, a poet, a translator, and who comes all the way from LA and who is speaking about Russian Angeleno poets. So it's a lot. A number of people worked hard to make this happen. First of all, the Institute for Liberal Studies. And by the way, I'm Maxim Shrayer, all of you know that, but let's mention it for the record. And this will all be on the final. Okay, guys, those of you who are in my 20th century Russian literature class. So the Institute for the Liberal Arts sponsored this event, and of course the Department of Eastern Slavic and German Studies did, as well as the Eastern European Studies program. And I'd like to begin with a brief recollection, which will put it in some context. In the summer of 1986, I traveled around the area of the Black Sea, and I happened to be in Odessa very briefly. I went to an area called the seventh station of the big fountain, Седьмая станция Большого Фонтана, which is now a kind of, well, used to be before this terrible war, kind of glamorous area. And so basically imagine, it's my first time in Odessa, I don't have a lot of time, and I see on a little bench this young boy with angelic curls, and he's sitting on a bench, and he has in his hands a tattered volume of what I discovered to be John Milton. And he's sitting there with his volume, and he's leafing through it and taking notes. And I thought to myself, if this isn't a future poet translator, who is? And so many years went by, and then when I first saw Boris's photograph, I discovered that that was his younger self. And I was very satisfied with my prediction. And now, let me just say that Boris Dralyuk is many things. He is a scholar who has a PhD from UCLA, who has taught at UCLA and at St. Andrews University. He is a critic. He is one of the leading translators of Russian writers, including a number of writers that we have read, this group in this course, Isaac Babin, Mikhail Zощenko, and also he's given new voices to a number of contemporary writers from Russia. And in his capacity as the editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books, he's of late been dedicating a lot of space to voices from Ukraine, which I think is tremendously important because Ukraine is, particularly Odessa, is his home city and his ancestral home. I also want to congratulate Boris on the publication of his first collection of poetry, My Hollywood, which is about to come out in Philadelphia with Paul Dry Books, a very exciting new publisher. And with that in mind, Boris, I'm so happy to welcome you here to BC. I hope you come again. But for now, guys, this is a lecture and a reading called Russian Angeleno Poets. Please help me welcome Boris Dralyuk.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Maxim, for that glorious introduction. And I have to apologize. I would have spoken to you on that day in Odessa, but my mother told me never to talk to strangers, and I followed her advice. Thank you, everyone, again for coming to listen to my reading and presentation on the Russophone literature of Los Angeles. I'm going to use the term Russophone, partly because I've always preferred it, and also in part because the recent war has made that choice more politically charged. Some of the poets that whose work I will share with you are what I would call Ukrainian poets. Of course, they wrote in Russian, but for them, Ukraine was home. Ukraine was, as far as any place could be, the place to which they looked back lovingly. And you'll even hear Ukrainian place names in some of these poems. After I finish my presentation, please feel free to ask me any questions, not only about the content of this talk, but also about my work on Odessan literature and my sense of what's happening in Ukraine. I'll try to answer as best I can. But first I'll begin with the driest, most boring part of this talk, which is a series of numbers. How many of you have been to Los Angeles? Okay, so a fair number. And I'm sure everyone here has seen images of Los Angeles in film because, of course, it's the film capital of the world. So some of the place names will resonate with you. Sunset Boulevard, everyone knows that there's a Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. Everyone knows there's a Hollywood Boulevard, all of that stuff. You'll hear some of these things in these poems, and you'll see the perspective of these poets on those places. But who are the Russian speakers of Los Angeles? So the history of Los Angeles is fairly short. It's not an old town in its current configuration, and certainly the huge, populous, enormous metropolis that it is today, that's a fairly new development. That's a 20th century development. Around the turn of the 19th into the 20th centuries, the population of Los Angeles was about 50,000. Strangely, Russians already at that time, Russian speakers, from people from the Russian Empire, already constituted a small but significant portion of that population. Can anyone guess who these Russians were at that time? Who was emigrating from the Russian Empire in large numbers in the 19th century? People fleeing some kind of persecution generally. I'm gonna come out and say it, but you were about to say.
I was going to say people who were anti-Bolshevik.
Well, that was a little bit before the Russian Revolution, just a little bit before. Most of the people who were immigrating from the Russian Empire were victims of one way or another of the Tsarist regime, people who were persecuted under Tsarism. In the case of Russians, one would expect a lot of Jews. A lot of Jews immigrated from the Russian Empire. Also a lot of Poles from the lands that were then under Russian control. But the population of Russian speakers in Los Angeles, about 4,000 of them, these were sectarians. It's a religious sect known as the Malakani. They had been persecuted by the Russian Orthodox Church as well as by the state, and set out, along with other sectarians, to the New World to find a home. So most of the Russians that you would run into in Los Angeles at that time were highly religious sectarians, Orthodox sectarians. They did not produce much literature. That was not their main activity. They did a lot of worshiping, and they did a lot of community activity, but writing letters back home was probably low on their priority list. So when we talk about the literature of that period, we really can't show any examples of Russian writing from Los Angeles before the revolution. And yet there was this base of Russian speech there. So there was precedent for Russian migration. It was only during the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, and the subsequent Civil War that we saw a huge influx of literate and literary, sophisticated, modern Russians, people who were very much attuned to modern life, who were indeed fleeing, as you said, the Bolshevik Revolution and Bolshevik persecution. I don't know if you've shared these numbers, Maxim, in your preceding lectures, but between 1918 and 1930, the estimates of the number of people who left what was then already Soviet Russia and outlying districts are somewhere between 900,000 people and 2 million. Huge outpouring of talent, especially. These were people who were seeking a better life, who were trying to flee persecution, but also people who left behind very important careers, people who left behind very responsible jobs. A lot of these people were had already been well established. And so they brought with them a literary tradition. And that literary tradition flourished in Western Europe and eventually in the United States in the 1920s. In Paris, at the end of the 1920s, you had something like 200,000 Russians. Among them, some names that you'll surely recognize. Well, maybe not, but I hope you will someday. Writers like Nadezhda Tefi, writers like at that time Sidin, eventually Nabokov, although he was in Berlin at the time, he would soon migrate to Paris. Still at that point in the United States, very few names that you would recognize. Most of the Russian immigration ended up either in Asia or in Europe. Most of the writers were present there, working there, building their second careers there. writing in Russian outside of Russia. And only a small number wound up in New York and other parts of the United States. About 5,000 to 6,000 Russians ended up in Los Angeles in the 1920s. These Russians, I thought, left no trace of literature behind for a long time, until I discovered a wonderful epic poem about Russian Hollywood. Well, let's move this. I discovered a wonderful epic poem about Russian Hollywood, which I hope to share with you, by a man named Voloshin. So, sorry, I'll take this down here. There it is. So what I'll do for you is I'll read this little translation of a section of this book-length poem about the life of Russians in Hollywood in the 1920s. Things weren't looking good at first, but with the help of hunger, thirst, the Russians soon found new professions. Look here, a seasoned barrister no longer bothers with confessions. Instead, he copies out film scores for studios. One officer is now butler and chauffeur. Sure, there were many lamentations, but also countless transformations. With enviable sleight of hand, our science lecturers began to beautify the local ladies. Their past anxiety now fading, without a worry or a care, our aunties skillfully prepare embroidered silk, satin, and tulle. Meanwhile, a major general repairs your footwear while you wait. Forgetting brilliant parades, our brave brigade commanders mow your lawn, make sure your roses grow. A lauded senior engineer is a mechanic, shifting gears. An actor of the Russian theater has opened a cafe, serves beer or zhubruvka, cutlets or grilled beef. No stage for him and no relief. All day he stands behind the bar, but those hot goods can get you far. He slings his cocktails to the throngs of patrons, even sings old songs with a guitar for company. The actor's happy as can be. He needs no fame now that he's found respect and has a bank account. So what do you gather from this depiction of Russian life? Who were these Russians before they left the Russian Empire? Or what was then already the Soviet Union? They were pretty established people, major generals. They were lawyers. They were women of high status in society, aristocrats. And now what are they doing? They're mowing lawns. It's the fate of all emigres to start at the bottom of the ladder and to try to crawl your way up. So it's perfectly understandable for me that these people who ended up in Los Angeles weren't writing much poetry. It's actually kind of a miracle that Voloshin found the time between trying to be an actor, running a bar, when he talks about this little bar, that's basically kind of his life. He found the time to write this epic poem, because writing takes leisure time, or insane passion. And I think he had a mix of, more insane passion in himself than he had leisure time on his hands. So this is probably the earliest fragment of Angeleno Russian poetry, Russian language poetry that I could find. And it already hits all of the spots that we'll be hitting in this presentation. The notion of people displaced, trying to build a new life abroad. The notion of also Russians kind of playing up Russianness, or people from the Russian Empire playing up Russianness in order to make a living. It was extremely fashionable in Hollywood in the 1920s and 1930s to dress like a Russian general, even if in fact you were never a general, to play up your rank in the Russian army so as to get preferential treatment, and also perhaps to appear in films. So there was a huge need for Russian extras in films. There were a lot of films about the revolution, and they wanted real, authentic Russians to play the supporting roles. Well, many of the people who were playing these supportive roles had never even fought in the army. They, some of them weren't even Russian, but they played up their Russianness, for the crowds. And they opened up countless restaurants named Bublichki and, sold shashliks and all of this kind of stuff in order to appeal to the tastes for exoticism that were coming up at that time. So that was the white emigration of the 1920s and 1930s. We call it the white emigration because these people are associated with the opposition to the Bolsheviks, the White Army. As I say, this is probably the masterpiece of that period. It's not much, but I like it. And I have other, if you want to see more, you can always go to my blog. The real masterpieces that I was able to find, and it was hard to find them because most of this poetry appeared in journals that were so poorly printed they fall apart 2 weeks after they're published. Some of it was self-published in book form, but those copies moldered in a box in the poet's house over decades. This is kind of also the fate of most emigres, is to write into the void. But you did see the appearance of poems that I think are very significant and do something very original after the Second World War. Now this was, the second wave of emigration is not associated in Russian scholarship or scholarship of Russian literature with a tremendous outburst of talent. There are a number of names that most people who know anything about Russian literature can name. There are great poets like Morshin. By the way, I highly recommend if you don't know Morshin's a wonderful poet. But really the number of people who emigrated directly after the Second World War who had great literary ambition and great literary skill, it's not as big as the number of people who emigrated after the first catastrophe, the revolution. And yet a number of these very talented people who emigrated at that time ended up in Los Angeles. So I'm going to name a few of these people. The first one I'd like to speak about is perhaps, I think, the most talented person of this group. And he had a life that, in some ways, connects very painfully to the events that we see unfolding in Ukraine today. His name was Vladislav Ellis. Ellis does not sound like a Russian name, does it? It's not a Russian name. It's an English name. He was descended from Englishmen who had been invited to the Russian Empire to ply their very specific trade. They were welders, master welders. They were needed for the building of the empire. And this tradition was very important for his family. So generation after generation, the people in his family received a high degree of scientific training and industrial training and were worked in industry, including Ellis himself. He grew up in Ukraine. He associated the happiest memories of his life with Ukraine. Although he was of English stock and invited into the Russian Empire, Ukraine was really his home. During the great repressions of the 1930s, which perhaps you've covered, both his brother and his father were arrested and executed in 1937. Put yourself in that position and then imagine 3 years later, after the assassination, essentially, the murder, execution of the other men in your family, you're conscripted into the Soviet army and you're expected to fight against Nazi Germany. Which he did. He was conscripted into the army. He did fight, but he was taken prisoner. So not only has he lost his family to the Stalinist purges, but he is also now a prisoner of war in Nazi Germany. Very, very likely would be killed if he didn't have special skills. So what he did during the Second World War is he worked basically as a slave laborer for the Nazi regime. And after the end of the war, ended up in a displaced persons camp, which is the fate of most people who were of Slavic or other national descent who were trapped behind German lines. In this DP camp, things could have gone one or two ways. He could have stayed in the West, or he could have been returned to the Soviet Union. The fate awaiting him in the Soviet Union was almost, without question, death, execution, because of his collaboration with the Nazi regime, as it was perceived at the time, and because of just the suspicion that he might be a spy. So instead, he stayed behind in the West with his family. He managed to find work in Belgium, and eventually landed in the United States. Now, a lot of people who had that kind of background were deceptive about their background for good reason. It's not something you want to admit that you worked as a slave laborer or any kind of laborer for the Nazis during the Second World War. So many of the people from the Soviet Union who ended up going through DP camps and then emigrated fudged their biographical for their biographical background. What I find most admirable about Ellis is that he never hid any of these things, and in fact interrogated himself about this guilt that he felt, and perhaps the stain on his background that this represented. That's at least as I see it. Now, usually when a poet publishes a collection of poems, the publisher has some input in the way that the poems are arranged. The publisher and the editor sometimes say, well, we don't like this poem, we like that other poem. When the luxury of publishing something yourself is that you can arrange the volume any way you want. Ellis published one collection of poems in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, and he self-published it because that's how most Russian emigres were publishing their work. And the first poem in the volume I'm going to share with you is, I think, incredibly daring because it confronts other emigres of his generation especially with this spotty history of the Second World War. It's called Lie, My Friend. Would you like me to read it in Russian and English, or? Okay. Ври, мой друг, ври, как рвались к последней ставке, вы в бою, презирая страх. Я с тебя не потребую справки о полученных орденах. Как косил истребителей стаю, как любил в лазарете сестру. Ври, мой друг, я тебя понимаю. Ты закончишь, и я совру. Этим ухарски глупым запоем, боль о прошлом неутолим. Все мы были когда-то герои, правда, меньше, чем говорим. Ври, мой друг, и в душевной ране за бутылкой утихнет мразь, коль грядущая в черном тумане, так прошедшая розовым крась. And in English, lie, my friend. Lie about your great battles and how you conquered your fear. No need to show me your medals. We're all well bemedaled here. Lie about shooting down warplanes and the nurse that treated your wounds. Go on, lie all you want to, friend. When you're done, I'll lie a bit too. Of course, our boasting won't free us from what happened or drown all our pain. Yes, back there, we were all of us heroes, just not as much as we claim. When the dirt rises up in your breast, choke it down, knock a few back. Add a bold, ruddy hue to your past, since your future is shrouded in black. Now, that is a very bold way, I would say, to begin a collection of poems that is meant to show your best self to the world. And this is what makes, I think, Ellis so admirable. There were a lot of other poets who came through the same experience that he came through, who did everything they could to obscure that dirt in their soul that the war had left. That's a very dark thing to share. I'm very sorry. I got you all bummed out. So let me try to cheer you up a little bit, but only as emigres do, with a bittersweetness, not pure bitterness. Another thing I really love about Ellis is that he was an inveterate traveler, and everywhere he went, he wrote a poem. Not all of these poems are good, but his lust for life, his passion for life was so rich that he was able to kind of absorb everything that he saw. He ended up working in construction, again, as a very highly trained engineer, and was sent on building sites all across the world, including places like Vietnam. And everywhere he went, he would see something that would inspire a little poem. But this is close to home, so now we're getting back to Los Angeles. And the poem I'd like to share now is called The Mexican Birch. Now, what appeals to me about this poem is that it reflects a very important aspect of Californian life and what makes California so special. Driving through Boston today to get here, I saw a lot of vegetation, but it was all of a piece. It made sense. You know, the kinds of trees you see, they grow next to each other. That's the way they're supposed to grow. When you get to California, you see a palm tree, a pine, a eucalyptus, a cactus. You can see everything from all around the world growing side by side, and it doesn't make sense. It just defies imagination. Old postcards sent from the West Coast to the East Coast to tempt people to come out and settle on the West usually depict this weird collocation of vegetation to tell them that this is really paradise on earth. You know, this is the way life is supposed to be. Everything, you know, the lion lies down with the lamb. This is California for you. And so Ellis looks at this and does something very interesting with it. He twists it a little bit. The poem is called The Mexican Birch, and the birch tree, for anyone who has studied Russian culture, they know that the birch is very important for the soul of, you know, Russianness, as well as most East Slavic lands. The birch is a symbol of feminine beauty in the East Slavic lands. And here he tries to get a little bit of that old world that he loves planted in California. We disfigure nature to disrupt life's flatness. I plant a little birch tree beside a prickly cactus and instantly regret it. How I mourn for her, an orphan in the desert, a spindly foreigner. You know, birches are very thin. She'll dwell here, never hearing spring's light-hearted song. Heat slayed her catkin earring, barely burst, now gone. Fearfully, her slender trunk bends with the wind. All migrants understand her. It's hard without a friend. So he sees in this little tree that he plants wanting to return home an analogy for himself, an analogy for all emigres. We're alone here. Even if we can grow, if we can grow, the question of whether we can reproduce is open. You see, she has this little catkin, which is the way that birch trees reproduce themselves, and unfortunately it's too hot for the catkin to last. So the tree is planted, it's growing, but it has no future in this place, and it has no friends. So it's a nice, cheerful little poem about a very sad subject. And you notice the music is very lively. I try to preserve these things because they're integral to the effect of the poems. If it were just, you know, written in dull prose, it would just be depressing. But with this little peppiness to it, it adds a little flavor, balance. So that's Ellis, a poet that I deeply admire. He's in this little book. Voloshin is not. And since we're still on a cheerful subject, I'm going to read to you another cheerful poem. This is Vernon Duke. Now, he's by far the most famous of these poets, but he's not famous for poetry. Has anyone heard his name before? Are there any music students in the class? Does Vernon Duke sound like a Russian name or a Slavic name? No. His real name was Vladimir Petrovsky. He was born in Belarus and grew up also largely in Ukraine, was trained in Ukraine at the Kiev Conservatory. And as Vladimir Petrovsky, he became a fairly prominent classical composer. Not first rank, not Prokofiev, not Stravinsky, but, you know, respectable. As Vernon Duke, his pseudonym, he became a wildly successful American composer of popular song and lyrics. April in Paris, Autumn in New York, these are all Vernon Duke compositions. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Autumn in New York, the lyrics in English are written by Vernon Duke. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he is a multi-talented and extremely impressive survivor. He emigrated right after the First World War to right after the First World War and Revolution to Constantinople, like many people from that part of the former Russian Empire. And in Constantinople, he became a very close friend of a poet named Boris Dralyuk, who was one of the more talented younger poets of the first wave of Russian emigration. Poplavsky is a true original, a surrealist before surrealism in some ways, a kind of high romantic Rimbaud of Russian poetry from that period. Dukeski was writing poems, but they weren't so good. They were okay, enough to hang out with Poplavsky. It's only after he established himself as in music in the United States after emigrating from Europe that he returned to writing poetry in Russian seriously. And the poems that he wrote in Russian in Los Angeles are so well observed and so sprightly that when you read them, you feel like this man had really just grown up in LA. You know, he just knows the terrain so well because he really sank into life there. So I'll just read one little poem that could easily have been written by an American poet. It's called Sunset Strip. And all of his titles, by the way, are in English. So for these Los Angeles poems. So there's a macaronic effect to the poems. He incorporates English phrases, incorporates English even text into some of this work. Sunset Strip. It's about an actress. Poor lady is in tatters, disheveled and distressed, a star of yesterday. Abandoned by the cameras, no wonder she's depressed. Her heart is drained away. Look all you like, no matter, won't guess how old she is. Her dress is dull and gray. Despite her stately manners, she can't keep up appearances without her former pay. Her days drag on, relentless. Her furs are worn and frayed. Oh, sorry. Her eyes look tired and lifeless. Her furs are worn and frayed. Oh, Hollywood, how horrid. Look, Lord, work your little wonders. Restore her faded fame. That's this touching little poem of a worn-out star. You can see it in the films of the 1950s and 1960s, and you can see it in the poems of this Russian man who also composes classical music, who's sitting at his home in Hollywood and participating in the culture, in the broader culture. So what I really like about Duke is that he represents that it's possible to really blend in, to make a life. Most of the emigre stories we hear are sad stories, are stories of people who never adapted or in some ways are always looking back. And Vernon Duke, for me, represents a person who's always looking forward. So it takes all kinds, yeah? Now we'll go back to depression, because I can't stay away from depression too long. And I'll show you the counterexample to Duke. A contemporary of Duke's, a little bit older, named Vladimir Petrovsky. When I share these poems with my friends, I try to include, and my fellow readers of poetry, I try to include the photographs because the photographs tell you a lot about the kinds of lives that these people lived. And many people noted that Petrovsky even looks like T.S. Eliot. The exactly the same haircut, kind of the same cut of face, the big ears, the sad expression in his eyes, the gaze. Petrovsky had reason to be depressed, probably more so than T.S. Eliot. He had a very difficult life. Also a man of Ukraine. You can tell by his name that by origin he is a nobleman. Double-barreled names usually reflect nobility. And of the Polish line. So he's a Polish nobleman, but wrote in Russian and identified with his homeland. During the Civil War, he fought against the Bolsheviks and was taken prisoner. He was slated for execution and managed to escape. Walked to Europe to safety, got to safety. Established himself first in Berlin, where he was an associate of many of the poets who were working there, including Nabokov. Then, like many of them, had to emigrate once more from Berlin to Paris as the Nazis gained power. In Paris, he joined the resistance during the Second World War, and guess what happened? He got captured again. Again was slated for execution. Again, almost mysteriously survived, because had he been captured a little bit earlier, he probably would have either been executed or sent to a camp. But he ended up staying in the jail in which he was being held until liberation. Once liberated, he managed to emigrate. He stayed in Paris for some time, and then managed to emigrate at the end of his life, for the last 5 years of his life, to Los Angeles, where he lived in relative happiness, but his health was already failing. And so I think the last poem that I'll share with you is one of the sadder poems certainly in this book that I've prepared, and one of the sadder emigre poems that I've encountered. In translation, I've called it Exiles Return, and I'll set the scene for you. The scene is the port of Los Angeles, and he imagines in 1961 his death, which is coming soon. In fact, 5 years later, he would be dead. But he imagines what will happen, perhaps, if he's lucky, which is that his body will somehow be picked up by a Russian military ship, Russian warship, which now has a different connotation after the Ukrainian war, Russian warships. Yeah. So this Russian warship does the right thing. It picks up the coffin of a hero, but of the wrong side, and brings him back home, perhaps to be buried where he wishes to be buried. The place names that you'll encounter in this poem are Kronstadt, which is the seat of the Russian imperial fleet in the Baltic. Also the site of a major rebellion in the early 1920s against the Bolsheviks by the sailors. And Kattegat and other places in the Gulf of Finland. So, exiles return. To perform a final honor, a sleek cruiser from Kronstadt sails into the silent harbor slowly like a juggernaut. Ready for its distant journey, taking leave of foreign lands, comes a lightweight coffin swaying through a sea of lowered heads. Were we right or wrong? No matter. Flags at half-mast on the stern. With its scrap of Russian glory in the hold, the vessel turns. Such great heights, such depths below, joyful foam sprays everywhere, and a farewell siren bellows lonely in the azure air. All those stars and all those countries, the return he had long sought, a thick northern fog engorges the thin-throated Kattegat. As it nears the Gulf of Finland through the Baltic, drizzly, dull, waves, serene yet unrelenting, beat against the cruiser's hull. In the brief glare from the lighthouse, they rise up and pass away, clouds and islands, lots of smoke, a barren cape. Is that too depressing a note to end on? No? Okay, well then I'm done. Thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you very much for your, I could see engagement with these poems. It means a lot to me to be able to share this work and see it received.
Thank you. Stay where you are, please, Boris, because I'm sure we'll have questions.
Yes. Also, I'm very happy to share more poems if you'd like to hear them. I just don't want to overload you.
Yeah. So please, people, raise your hands. We'll have a free-flowing conversation. I'm sure there are comments and thoughts and reflections.
If not, I can just keep reading, believe me.
Do you have a personal favorite from the poems that you've selected?
Yes, I do. I think I can answer that question in two ways. I think the poem that is most masterful and most telling is this one. I think this is probably the best poem of that group. However, my personal favorite is a long poem about the farmers market, which is a place where I happen to spend every free hour in Los Angeles. It's just a few blocks away from my house, by Vernon Duke. So I can show you the picture of it, if you'd like to see. This is an old postcard, and it still looks this way. It's a cornucopia. It's just, a delightful, life-affirming place to be, where you can see people of all walks of life, in all forms of dress, enjoying themselves. So what I loved about this poem is that it captures that incredible diversity. I can read it for you. It's a little long, but if you want, I can read it for you. But you can read it by yourself if you go to my blog and discover it. So I'd say this is probably the sweetest, juiciest poem that I discovered. Yeah.
So you being like immigrating to the U.S. yourself, like could you relate to any of these writers in your experience in the U.S. for the first time?
That's such a great question. To every single one of them. I happen to think of these poems and poems in general as capturing an entire person, but one aspect of that person. So we all carry within us multiple personalities. Every time that we're happy, we're a happy version of ourselves. When we're a depressed version of ourselves. What a poem does is it fixes permanently what you were at the moment that you conceived, wrote, worked on it. You create a perfect person that just sits there on the page, waiting to be encountered. And if the poem works, that whole person is there. And when you see it, you connect with that person, you become that person when you read it. You know, for the duration of reading the poem, you are that version of yourself, the sad version of yourself, the happy version of yourself, the melancholy or the chipper version of yourself. And so I saw in every one of these poems some aspect of my experience. And while I was working on them, I became that aspect of myself, you know. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a miracle what a poem does. It's entirely three-dimensional. It looks like it's just words on a page, but it really pops. Yeah. Oh, yes, there's a question right there.
Justin,
go ahead.
This is kind of an abstract question, but what do you think these emigre writers would say? Like, what would tell the currently displaced Ukrainian immigrants / people living down in the subway stations and so forth?
It's such a great question. And it connects actually to the preceding question. I don't have, while translating or while encountering these poems, I'm encountering an abstract person, the person that this poet created while writing the poem. I actually don't know what any of these people would say in reaction to what's happening. For all I know, they would be rabid Putinists. I have no idea. But I think in their best moments, when sitting down to write a poem, just as Ellis sat down to write that poem about the people faking their war record, in their best moments, when facing the page and themselves and nothing else, they would feel the human dimensions of this conflict, and their hearts would be with the people who are undergoing bombardment. I think that you can see that even now, people who, before this war started, which is an 8-year war, were very happy, like myself. I was, I'm from Ukraine, I'm Jewish, I'm Russian speaking. I didn't think of myself as especially Ukrainian, but I just thought of myself as being born in Ukraine. But my identity changed over time to reflect my deep connection to Ukraine. My travels to Russia showed me that I had less in common with Russians than I did with even the non-Jewish Ukrainians that I encountered in Ukraine. And so I refined my own identity. And I have no idea how these people would have refined their identity had they been given the chance to live another 100 years. It would have changed, I'm sure, 10 times over. But if they're good poets, if they're honest poets, then what they would reflect is the human toll of this conflict, and they would connect with the people undergoing these terrors, these catastrophes. They would see a reflection of their own experience in what's happening now. So regardless of their politics, they would connect. That's while writing poems. And then later they could say some awful nasty things over dinner, which is what poets tend to do, They write a good poem, you think they're a great person, and then later you talk to them and it turns out they're not so hot. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to add a comment to that, if I may, I think this touches on a very, very sensitive nerve in what's happening today, particularly in the immigrant community, because I'm personally in conversation with the people of my generation and of my parents' generation who were born in America to immigrant clans, some who came to America in the 1920s, others as displaced people in the 1940s, and many of them have roots in Ukraine,
Yes.
although they're ethnic Russians,
Yes.
some Jews, and they feel this tremendous new anxiety about
Yes.
their identity
Yes.
because they feel that their roots are being destroyed by the very identity which
Mhm.
they associate with themselves.
Precisely right. Exactly right. Exactly right. And it's not so much even a matter of picking sides. It's a matter of this incoherence of this whole thing, which adds to the tragedy.
Yeah. By the way, I went to graduate school with Marina Vorontsov-Dashkov, whose father, Alexander Vorontsov-Dashkov, who used to teach at Smith, grew up in LA, and his parents were close friends with Pyotr Vetrov,
yes.
and he devoted several poems to them. And I mean, I can only imagine how these families now feel
I know.
with everything that's going on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, you know, a great many people, there have been stories and reported pieces from these immigrant communities in Los Angeles and New York. People have discovered that, you know, in a moment like this, they stand with their home and they redefine their definition of home. You know, these are Soviet-born people, many of them, and the Soviet Union no longer exists. And what exists in its place are two nations. And one of them is more or less a modern democracy, and the other one is, you know what it is. So they refine, despite their language, they refine their notion of where they came from after the fact, because the old country doesn't exist anymore. Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you very much for posing it.
Questions, comments?
On that score, I can actually share another poem, very, very brief poem, that also reflects on this mix of identities, because we've touched now on the ethnic makeup of the Soviet Union and the Russophone culture of the entire Soviet Union. Well, this is a perfect example. This is one of the sadder stories in the book concerns the poet Pyotr Vetrov, this man. And he was half Armenian, half Russian, not an uncommon mix, was a fairly prominent figure in the 1960s in Moscow as a poet, part of the same group that included Yevtushenko and Voznesensky. And in the 1980s, at the end of the 1980s, he emigrated to the United States and he settled in Los Angeles. At that point, he turned his attention more to painting than writing, and it's sometimes even harder for painters abroad to make a career than it is for poets. He, unfortunately, at a very young age, succumbed to alcoholism. He had a very tragic last few years of his life, and he was a neighbor of mine. I didn't know it, but he was just two or three doors down from me on the street where I lived at that time. And I had no idea there was a really good poet living just a few blocks away, a few doors away. And what I see in this poem is something very beautiful. And it talks about the multiple homes of emigres. He was not from Armenia, he was from Moscow. But as an Armenian, he connected with all of the Armenians in Los Angeles, which includes not just Armenians who immigrated from the Soviet Union, but also Western Armenians who had emigrated through other countries after the catastrophe of the Armenian people, the genocide of the 19-teens. And so he's writing in Russian in Hollywood and connecting with Armenians, whether they speak Russian or not, whether they speak Armenian or not, or his kind of Armenian. And I can imagine this right now because I see the balcony where he would have seen this. And it's important to note that for Armenians, the mountain Ararat is a holy mountain. Armenians unhurriedly walk through the streets of Hollywood bearing lavash and kali greens. All that they've grown accustomed to, where Ararat blocks half the sky, where Ararat fills up your soul so that you never can escape, even halfway around the world. True love for women or for mountains is all the same, a sacred poison. No matter what, there's no deliverance. Go on then, live, try to remember. And if your memory should fail you, your loved one will still find you, always. This morning I awoke in Hollywood to springtime, hummingbirds, magnolias, and from my balcony I spotted my dear Armenians, unhurried. While in the sky above, what's that? The great, the holy Ararat. So he's seeing, instead of the Hollywood Hills, the sacred mountain of the Armenian people, but writing in Russian. And, is right here in Los Angeles. So the identity is a complicated thing.
Well, I have a question. I wonder if you could comment on your decision to include your own original poems with translations, because I find this to be a growing trend in the English language publishing culture, and of course it is a prominent trend in the Russian and Soviet tradition, where some of the best poets were also master translators, although not necessarily from the original language.
That's very true.
Yeah, but I saw, not your case, but I wonder if you could speak about that.
Well, yes, I think that in this case it made sense to do it because my own poems concern life as an emigre in Hollywood. And I had discovered that I was part of a tradition, and I wanted to show that tradition to create for readers a sense that I wasn't coming out of nothing. So in a way, it's paying homage to what came before, but also creating a horizon of expectations for readers to connect my work and make sense of it in relation to the work of other poets who had undergone the same experience. So that's one motivation. But the other motivation is that I write formal poems. So I write poems that reflect my Russophone origins. I write Onegin stanzas as opposed to sonnets. You know, I have some sonnets in the book, but I have some other 14-line poems that are actually structured the way that Pushkin structured his Onegin stanzas. And there was so much of this kind of the ghost of Russophone literary culture in the book that I felt it made sense to include some actual Russians too, and also to show that I'm working in that formal tradition. Most Russian poetry up until the late 20th and even into the 21st century, most Russian poetry was still formal, still written with rhyme and meter. Free verse only took off maybe 10, 15 years ago as a very, very popular form of writing in Russophone cultures. So I wanted to explain in a way to readers that, you know, I'm not just writing formal poetry because I'm a political conservative, which I'm not. I'm writing formal poetry because I come from a tradition in which formal poetry still lives. Yeah. There is a little bit of a taint, you know. Some people do assume that politics goes along with form. And in my view, that's not the case. I think that sometimes, you know, the people who write formal poetry are quite right of center, and sometimes they're smack dab in the middle, and sometimes they're very left. And in my case, I'm drawn to it for the possibilities that it holds for me. It makes me feel like I'm doing two things at once. I'm not just writing a statement, I'm creating a three-dimensional version of that statement that becomes memorable in a way that plain prose perhaps is not memorable. Like sculpture instead of painting. Yeah. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
I'll ask a question. Thank you very much for the informative talk. And at one point you mentioned the musicality of various poems.
Yes.
You also mentioned the likes of Stravinsky and others. And I wonder, I teach a course on Russian music and art here, and if you can speak about, well, whether there any interaction with the other immigrants like Rachmaninoff, Stravinsky, and did any of these poems become transposed into songs, for example, to
Oh, I so
life?
wish they had been. That's such a wonderful question. I so wish somebody had set these songs to music because, unfortunately, no. Even Duke, who could have done it himself, didn't do it for some reason. And there's a nice tradition of art song in Russian. A very, I'm sure as you know very well, there's, you know, they didn't stop doing it in the 20th century. They kept doing it and do it to this day. But none of the poems that I've translated has been set to music. However, there was very close interaction between Vernon Duke and Stravinsky. They were friends. They were acquaintances and even friends. They both loved the farmer's market. Stravinsky had lunch there every day. And they were also in touch, some of these people were in touch with emigre communities from other nations. So there was some interaction with the German emigres, the German language emigres who left during the, you know, in the run-up to the Second World War and during the Second World War. A lot of these connections were formed through the films, you know, the film industry. So they were writing film scores and contributing various other things to film. So yes, there was some interaction. And Rachmaninoff was buried, he died in Los Angeles, and his service was held at the Russian church of which many of these people were members, which still stands in Silver Lake. It's called the Holy Virgin Mary Church. And an interesting story about that, because it's Los Angeles, the church is built along according to a design that was originally a stage set for a film set that was an adaptation of Tolstoy's The Cossacks. So they built a little village church for the film, and then they used that design to basically expand the actual Russian church in Silver Lake. Yeah. Yeah. So there was a little bit of overlap, but I mean, if you can do it, do it. You know?
I'm a performer, not
Oh, damn. Yeah.
But is perhaps, I think, yes, please, CC, yes.
I was wondering if you found anything comparable from Russian-speaking emigres to other parts of America or places in Europe or elsewhere.
I think that this is the Russian culture is logocentric. The word matters a lot for Russians, and this is one of the great things about them. One of the few great things about Russian speakers is that wherever you drop them, they're going to write some poems. It's just going to happen. It's unavoidable. So yes, all across the U.S. You can drop a pin on Google Map and you'll find a Russian poet. It's just that way. It's just that way. And I did discover some even in places that where it was fairly hard to discover them. For instance, in Seattle, there was a significant Russian language emigre community, but very few of them were writers. Many of them were industrial workers. And engineers and highly trained people, and also people involved in maritime trade. And so I did find one eventually, because I was challenged to find one by somebody who lives in Seattle. Well, you've done all, they said to me, you've done so much for Los Angeles, can you find somebody from Seattle where I live? So I did, I found somebody. In New York, there was a ton, of course. It was a very robust literary community. And in places in Canada, you could find, in Toronto and Montreal, various locations. 2 or 3 Russians is enough for a newspaper, So they'll do something, yeah. Yeah, it's a very good question, yeah. I mean, I'm of course particularly drawn to Los Angeles because it's my home, and I feel I can see these things and therefore translate them more successfully. But I've also translated some poems by emigres from other parts of the country.
Would it be too much to ask if you perhaps read one of your
I'd be very
original
happy
poems?
to, of course.
Yeah, so
I was just waiting for somebody to say it. I mean,
Well.
Maxim, it took you long enough. Okay, I can read a poem that. How many of you grew up in emigre households? Immigrants from any place? Yeah. Okay, a couple of people. Do you remember shopping with your parents? Was it slightly embarrassing because you went to the cheapest possible stores and you bought? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so this is for young people, it's embarrassing. For older emigres, when they come to the United States and you see this abundance of goods at very, very affordable prices, it's hard to resist, especially if you're coming from a country in which goods are hard to come by. So I have, from my childhood, I have fond memories of this remarkable place that has gone unremarked. It was a gigantic store with a big clown in front of it and a big sign that said Bargain Circus. Huge, huge discount store. And you would walk in and it was a circus and a zoo and every kind of entertainment you could want, and everything was within reach, 99 cents or less. And so I thought it was a wonderland. And especially if I had a bad day at school as a young person, I would beg my mother to take me there so that I could buy something to make myself feel better. The shopping therapy is something you acquire very early on in America. So, so this is about the store Bargain Circus, which is now just a 99-cent store. They tore down the sign, they gutted it, and replaced it with, standard issue stuff. Bargain Circus. And the epigraph is from the Los Angeles Times from 1997. So it goes at Bargain Circus, perhaps LA's most whimsical discount store. The eclectic selection of goods and guilt-inducing low prices draw a melange of Orthodox Jews, Russians, Armenians, and West Side connoisseurs. Los Angeles Times, 1987. Bargain Circus. Clown prince of bargain shops. Those penny ante Xanadu's that take up half a block was the La Brea Circus. Huge barn chock full of overstock, a poor man's horn of plenty. Where we, though broke as sparrows, like canaries flitted about, whistled with disbelief at deals, no steals that would abash a thief. Big pens for nickels, dollar dictionaries. I wore my Webster's out, clumsily wooing the tongue in which I sing this dime store's praise. But they're worn too, my memories of those days, like VHS tapes, after years of viewing and spooling backwards to the sweetest spot. Oh yes, that was another thing we bought. A plastic sports car VHS rewinder. So obsolete, so perfectly designed for its vanished purpose, like a streamlined hearse, inexorably heading in reverse. Thank you. So I'm glad I got, Bargain Circus in print. That's the real joy of this book. Yeah. And other poems in the book have also pay homage to these sites that are invisible. There's a library for Russian emigres that was founded by older emigres in the 1990s. They pooled their resources, all the books they had brought with them, and organized them. And they did this all without any help, all by themselves. They petitioned the city to open a room at the local park, and they arranged this library. And it was in constant use until the people started dying. The older generation just faded away, and every day there were fewer and fewer people coming. And now they had to move the library to another location. And when you're passing it in the street, you wouldn't know that there's anything behind this brick wall without any markings on it. But if you step inside, you still see some of the old people. You still see some of those, wonderful books that they brought over from the 1990s. And I wanted to memorialize this place. So I wrote a little poem called Emigre Library for it. In a way, it's a book of preservation. That's my intent.
Shall we thank Boris Dralyuk one more time?